Welcome back to A Foggy Day in Olympus, everybody. This is the place where we attempt to take an Olympian view of issues of history, religion, and culture and why they matter. My name is Mike Pierce.
And I am the long-suffering Coel Campo.
I'll give her a violin, somebody.
So this is now the fourth episode in our series on the 20th century Balkans. And as we've mentioned before, we're really defining Balkans in our own sense to mean only the territories that at various points formed Yugoslavia.
Yeah, and today we're on to Yugoslavia 2.0, the communist version.
Yes, the first one, the kingdom, having gone up in fire and smoke during World War II.
Yes, that's true.
So today we're looking at what really came out of that dreadful inferno. And although it looked at first like it would be very similar to all the other communist states, it turned out to be pretty unique, actually, in many ways. And so, first off, communist Yugoslavia came to be almost synonymous with the person of Tito.
Yeah, and that was a strength for as long as he lived. But by the nature of the case came with a built-in sell-by date.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that later. But this picture is of him from 1928. And he was in and out of prison during the interwar period, right?
Yes, the Communist Party was illegal and pretty small.
Right. Now, we traced the rise and military success of the Partisans during World War II. So if you haven't seen last week's episode, Balkan Apocalypse, do please check that out and all will be explained.
Yes. Tito became General Secretary of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia formally in 1939, de facto from a couple of years before. And he went on to form and lead the Partisans in World War II. And in Communist Yugoslavia, he was Prime Minister from 1943, when the Partisans didn't really control the territory at that point. They did mostly by late the following year, until 1963, and then president after that until the end of his life. And he had the honorific title of Marshal of Yugoslavia for the whole of that period. So if any viewers have heard mention of Marshal Tito, that will be why.
Some cool titles he gets to hold on to there.
Yes. Okay, so this is a wartime partisan poster with Tito as the central figure, and putting an end to fascism and inter-ethnic massacre always remained the communists' principal claims to legitimacy.
Yes, because the violence had been so awful that the resurgence of nationalism really remained a central concern of the regime.
Yeah, right the way on through. Tito and his colleagues were painfully aware that the resentment of Serb dominance had been one of the reasons that the first Yugoslavia ended in dreadful massacre. So Yugoslavia 2.0, as we might call it, was officially federal. There were 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia. And within Serbia, Vojvodina in the north and Kosovo in the south were formally autonomous, although they didn't have much autonomy. And Macedonian was recognized as being a language. Right, in the interwar period, there's this absurd situation where the government in Belgrade is insisting that the speech of the Slavs down there is just a strange dialect of Serbian. So, yeah, the new government was no longer insisting that Slavs there were really Serbs who needed to speak Serbian. But they're not conceding that it's Bulgarian either, because that would then strengthen Bulgaria's claim to the territory.
You're creeping up on it, aren't you?
What?
Your favorite quip, a language is a dialect with an army? Yeah. Felt that one coming.
Yes.
So did it all work? I mean, did all the changes succeed in making the new Yugoslavia not Serb-dominated?
Less than before. The unalterable problem was that the Serbs were the largest single group within Yugoslavia. The predominance of Serbs in the Partisans was pretty strong. And also, you couldn't afford to alienate Serbs by making them feel like, well, you're just another ethnic group in the mix. So the whole thing was a tight balancing act. And there was no way that it could ever really be got right. There were constant adjustments made through the communist period, as we shall see. And as everybody watching this will know, the whole thing fell apart completely during the 1990s. So, yeah, there is that.
Right.
Okay, so there are many biographies of Tito, and Geoffrey Swain's is certainly the best one in English. Yeah, it's a little expensive, but I'd guide people towards that if they're thinking of buying. Well, here's a picture of Tito with Edvard Kardelj in the center, who was his most important colleague and ideologist in May 45, right at the end of the war there. And here we've got a picture, a portrait photo of Kardelj. He's a Slovene. He'd been imprisoned for being a communist in the early 1930s. Tito had a similar experience. And he was in the USSR from 1935 to 37, which was a dangerous place for anybody to be there. Representatives of foreign communist parties, they were particularly likely to be killed in the Stalinist purges, and he managed to avoid it somehow. In the early years after World War II, he's Tito's principal deputy, and he was the architect of workers' self-management. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, what that was. After the 1948 break with Stalin, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that's looking ahead here. We should mention this man who was pretty unpopular, Alexander Rankovic, who was Minister of Internal Affairs. And the more perceptive amongst our viewers will immediately intuit that that means he's going to be in charge of the secret police and general repression and enforcement measures, as indeed he was. And this was the source of his unpopularity. So the first incarnation of that was an organization called OSNA, the Department of National Security, which just operated for a couple of years and led to a circulating joke, OSNA svedozna, OSNA finds out everything. Right, that's not what they said about themselves. This is what people who wanted to make daring little political jokes said about them. So it's established by Rankovic. It was military, international, and internal intelligence and counterintelligence. And by the end of the war, it had files on nearly 18,000 people. But it was reorganized and reborn as UDBA, the State Security Administration. And that just led to a change in the joke. UDBA, tvoj sudba. UDBA, your destiny or your doom. So they were the secret police. They monitored anti-communists, people they called clericalists, so supporters of the Catholic and Orthodox churches who might be prone to Croatian or Serbian nationalism. So nationalists and separatists. And after the bust-up in 1948 with Stalin, it monitored communists who opposed the break with the Soviet Union. And it assassinated or kidnapped around 200 exiles abroad right up to 1990. And they kept files on over 1 million people. So, yeah, it was an octopus of an organization.
Now, this is files being kept on people within their own country, right? Within Yugoslavia.
Right. I mean, this happened in all of the communist countries, and in a number of them, it became a huge issue after the fall of communism. People wanted access to the files to see which of their neighbors had been spying on them or reporting them to the police and all this kind of thing. I don't think that ever became so much of an issue here. Basically, because everything disintegrated into war, and so there were even bigger things to think about, Yes.
Right.
Well, we got Tito and Rankovic here in 1957. And we need to mention also this man, Milovan Djilas, who's probably now the most famous of the lot because of his writings. He produced an awful lot of stuff. Until his descent from communism and fall from power as a result, he was second in authority only to Tito. So let's just briefly consider his biography. He is a very interesting character. He's born in Montenegro. I think we referenced the autobiography of his early years, Land Without Justice, in a previous series. He became a communist at university in Belgrade in 1932, when he would have been, just 21 years old. He was imprisoned shortly after for a few years on account of this. He proved a key partisan leader during World War II. He was sent on diplomatic missions to meet Stalin during and after the war. But by the mid-1950s, he's starting to become severely disillusioned with communism as it works itself out in practice. He criticized the emergence of what he called a new ruling class, communist apparatchiks of one kind or another. And he was expelled from the Central Committee in January 1954 and resigned from the party shortly after that. His criticisms continued, and he spent most of December 1954 through to December 1966 in prison. He wrote accounts of his wartime experiences, his conversations with Stalin, which we'll look at in a moment, an account of his own personal rise and fall. He wrote a biography of Njegos, the Prince Bishop of Montenegro, his homeland, in the 19th century, and a whole lot of other stuff, often to the embarrassment of the regime, and so he was published only in the West.
Yeah, now he was a pretty prolific writer, wasn't he?
Yeah, I'm being a good boy here and not recommending all of his books. Maybe just one in a few minutes.
I knew we wouldn't be spared.
And you were right.
So the first business of the communists was to establish their authority at the end of the war. And that really included turning on the ethnic minorities who identified with the Axis powers.
Yes. So that means, in practice, the ethnic Italians and ethnic Germans. Well, let's take a look at this map here. It comes from earlier in the century, 1910, so before the First World War, showing the ethnically Italian population of Carnero or Kvarner. That's the areas in orange. So an awful lot of the Istrian Peninsula, the town of Kirk Velia in Italian on the island of Velia, Kirk there, and a number of other places in Fiume, Rijeka.
Now, as we noticed last week, very many of the coastal towns had Italian names, and Istria and Stres had actually been part of Italy between the wars.
Yes. And Kirk or Velia was formerly part of Italy from 1941 until Italy bowed out of the war in 1943. But yeah, they'd had Romance-speaking populations all the way down the coast. This was simply one of the most intense concentrations of those populations. And now they're going to end up being expelled. Between the wars, Trieste had been well within Italy because, of course, the whole of the Istrian Peninsula had been within Italy. But the end of the war brought into question whether that city should be Italian at all, and Yugoslavia now takes the whole of Istria and a slice of the Julian March. The Julian March is that blue-shaded belt of land inland from Trieste there. And from the end of the war to 1953, 250,000 to 350,000 Italians left Yugoslavia, encouraged by the Foibe massacres, which killed 5,000 to 10,000 people. And we can see here a memorial to one of those massacres at Bazovica in Italy. Partisan revenge for wartime killings often made little distinction between mere Italians and active fascists. It sometimes treated them as though they were one and the same.
So some of this mass exodus is by choice, and some of it is they're being driven.
Yeah, that's right. It is. Although the choice is pretty heavily constrained. I mean, in almost any situation, if people have really got a choice, they'll stay where they're from, right? Although some people may have felt so uncomfortable in a new communist state. But forcible choices being made here. So we've got a picture here of ethnic Italians being driven out to Italy.
So these are people whose ancestors had lived in these towns and villages since antiquity.
Yeah. And if the ancestors had been Romanized back at the time of the Roman Empire, and of course, we're not going to know too much about that, maybe even before that, who knows? But yeah, since forever, let's say. And the status of Trieste was disputed for years after the war, finally being awarded to Italy. This is a picture from May 46, and you can see in the background there, somebody's put up posters definitely wanting it to be part of Yugoslavia, but that's not how it ended up.
I'm guessing this is another complicated story, isn't it?
It is a very complicated story, and we could do, I don't know about a whole episode, but a whole half episode just on that. But we're not going to. This is plenty. Let's just move on to this map here, which will show us how things ended up. In 1954, after several years as the Free City of Trieste, the city and its immediate environs are awarded to Italy. So that's the yellow bit and Zone A. And the northwest corner of Istria goes, along with the rest of Istria, to Yugoslavia. But just to hasten the process along, there's a particularly horrible incident in the city of Pula, which is the largest town on Istria. At 2 p.m. on 18th August 1946, a pile of old war ordnance on the beach at Vergarola in Pula exploded, killing 75 to 100 bathers, including 2 British soldiers, and injuring another 200 people. Now, even allowing for the desire of the British military to clear themselves of neglect, their investigation has been confirmed by later studies. The ordnance had been made safe. The explosion must have been deliberate.
So somebody set it off intentionally, because we are sure, aren't we, that the Brits weren't guilty of neglect?
Well, you could say they should have made sure that the ordnance wasn't there at all. The war had been over for more than a year, but there was so much to move. There was so much chaos in so many places. There are still millions and millions of displaced people. Getting everything sorted took many years. So simply disarming the fuses is clearly going to be a provisional step before the ordnance is finally removed. The tail end of the story is this. Here we've got this monument in Trieste to those who were killed in Pula. Suspicions at the time have, in more recent years, been confirmed. With the fall of communism in Yugoslavia, the files of the secret police are opened up, and the explosion was indeed the work of an OSNA agent, Josip Kovacic, and the idea was to create insecurity and encourage ethnic Italians to get the heck out. So, yeah, it was indeed an OSNA operation.
And OSNA being the secret police that we mentioned earlier.
Right, yes. Well, the other group that we need to mention, of course, are the ethnic Germans. So this is simply a small part of what's called the Austreibung der Deutschen, the driving out of the Germans at the end of World War II. 12 million were driven out of Central and Eastern Europe during 1944 to 46, and 320,000 were expelled from Yugoslavia, often after much mistreatment. So many ethnic Germans, the Donauschwaben, had been enthusiastic supporters of the wartime occupation by the Nazis. So perhaps it's not so surprising that this happened. But about 82,000 remained in Yugoslavia even after the expulsions, because inevitably the ethnicity of many people was a matter of doubt. German was widely spoken and understood going back to Habsburg times. Many people were from mixed marriages or of mixed descent.
It's funny how even the mangled attempt to expel Germans just illustrates the fallacy of the ethnic purity project of the Nazis.
Yeah, there are no ethnically pure people. This is the simple fact of the matter, right? So, yeah, it does in an ironic sense there. And of course, it's kind of humorous today because there's still a number of people around with German surnames, a lot of them with Slavicized German surnames. You look at something and it's superficially Slavic, and you just got to say it out loud and think, who are we kidding here? This is a German name. Yeah.
Right.
In general, who got to stay? Well, people who were married to Slavs, or if they were possessed of useful skills, or if they had supported the Partisans during the war, they were allowed to remain.
The new regime needs to worry about political opposition too.
Yes, it does. Stuff left over generally from the war. And we're just going to mention a couple of the most prominent examples here. This chap, we mentioned him last week, Draža Mihajlović. He had led the remnants of the Royal Yugoslav Army. So the army of the state that had existed before 1941. And he led their remnants during the war. But in practice, his Chetniks were Serb nationalists, but they had fought against the Partisans. And so there was a settling of scores with them. Here is Mihajlović on trial for his life in 1946. And his closing speech says, "I reminded the court of Hitler's message to Mussolini, saying that I was the greatest enemy of the Axis," which sounds like a bit of a stretch, but maybe that needs some contextualization. Perhaps the greatest enemy still at large, Bosnia and southern Serbia or something, I don't know, and was only waiting for the moment to attack. "I strove for much, I undertook much, but the gales of the world have carried away both me and my work," as indeed was the case, and he was executed. But we should also mention this man who ended up not being executed, the Archbishop of Zagreb, Alojzije Stepinac.
Now, this guy has a very high profile, even today, and many Catholic Croats want him to be declared a saint.
Yes, I have a queasy feeling about that. Not because I think Stepinac was a bad man, but as it relates to the internal politics of what's going on in Croatia right now. Here he is, as Archbishop of Zagreb, meeting the Poglavnik, the Ustasha's main guy during World War II.
So does that mean he was a supporter of the Ustasha?
The short answer is no.
But like everything, it's complicated?
Yeah, at some stage, I'd like to do some episodes on prominent churchmen persecuted by the communists, but the next 2 minutes I'll have to do for now. So he's in prison from 1946 to 51, and during his house arrest, he was made a cardinal. And here's Milovan Djilas a few years later talking about him. Now, by 1956, Djilas is already in trouble himself and has distanced himself from the communists, even though he's sympathetic to an overall communist outlook. And what he says is this: "To honestly tell the truth, I think, and not only I, that Stepinac is a man of integrity, a firm character whom it's impossible to break. He was really unjustly convicted, but how many times has it happened in history that just people were convicted out of political necessity?"
So why was he released?
Well, mostly it was US pressure. It was made a condition of receiving American economic aid. But staying with Djilas commenting on this, we've got some slightly contradictory, I'm not sure it's evidence, but judgments about it here. He, Stepinac, would certainly not have been brought to trial for his conduct in the war and his collaboration with the Croatian fascist leader Ante Pavelić had he not continued to oppose the new communist regime. I have no doubt that he collaborated with Pavelić, supported him, and urged him to force conversion on the Serbs. At the same time, however, he disassociated himself from Pavelić, remaining independent and loyal to Vatican policy. This does not mean there were no grounds for a charge against him.
This is where it sounds like Djilas is contradicting himself.
Yes, it does. It's very hard to make coherent sense out of that paragraph. The next one makes a lot more sense. Stepinac was attacked mainly for his conduct in the war, whereas the real reason for the trial was his post-war opposition. And this is the factor that unites Stepinac's case with those of a number of other senior, mostly Catholic leaders I'd like to look at in some future episode. They were put on trial by communist regimes for supposed collaboration with fascism. But that's mostly just a smokescreen. What it was really all about was their continued opposition to the new communist regimes after the war. This, Djilas says, could not be hidden. It became a serious problem for us after the break with the Soviets. A few years later, we found a way out that appeased the West while satisfying both our prestige and our insistence that he not return to the Archbishop's residence. He was interned in his native village without having his sentence revoked. So it was a sort of compromise.
So now we're going to move into the 1948 break with Stalin that we mentioned earlier.
Right.
And this bust up with the Soviet Union is really what put Yugoslavia in a very unique position.
Yes, it did. And the long-term effects were greater than the short-term ones, although the short-term ones were pretty significant too. Here we have a picture of Tito with Stalin and Molotov in Moscow in April 1945. So the war's just coming to a close. It's a standard kind of picture, signing a treaty of cooperation and friendship, as all the newly communist states had to do. But even at this stage, Tito's in a slightly unusual position in that he doesn't owe his position simply to having been installed by the Soviets. And at first, solidarity with the Soviet Union seems to be absolute. So here we've got a parade with Tito and Stalin being pictured together. It's the May Day parade in Belgrade in 1946. And here's Tito at his desk the following year with a big portrait of Stalin. Note the military uniform, the models of artillery and a tank. The leitmotif of the communist regimes throughout was coercion, particularly at this early stage after World War II. Now, how does this split unfold then? Yugoslav communists had expelled the Nazis and their allies with limited Soviet help, especially capturing Belgrade, and so they felt freer to be less deferential to Moscow. Secondly, Yugoslavia was determined to take Rijeka, Istria and Trieste from Italy at the end of the war, and in pursuit of this, to make sure that it happened, Western forces were attacked several times, including shooting down 4 US planes during 1945 to 48. And Stalin didn't like this at all. He was opposed to provoking the West. Remember that during this period, the West had nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union didn't. So he didn't want some big-scale confrontation with them. He wanted to abide by the agreements that he'd made with Churchill and Roosevelt. Tito also backed the Greek communists during their civil war from 1945 to 48. Stalin had already agreed with Britain and the US that Greece would remain in the West's sphere of influence. So he didn't want to mess with that.
So the split between them certainly wasn't because Tito, at this stage, was more moderate than Stalin.
No. If anything, he was more go for it and gung-ho.
Right.
Stalin was the one who was wanting to make sure that there wasn't an immediate third world war, which he calculated, probably correctly at that stage, that he would have lost. Tito also aspired to merge his country with Bulgaria and Albania, which Stalin also opposed.
Why was Stalin against this?
Well, because he doesn't want any other overmighty communist states. What he wants is a load of moderately small satellites that can be dominated from the Soviet Union. And if you think about it realistically, if a merger between Yugoslavia and Bulgaria and Albania had happened, I don't think it would have been possible. But if it had, who would have been in charge of that? It would have been Tito. So Stalin's just keeping him down here. And So in June 1948, Yugoslavia was expelled from the Cominform and thereafter is not really part of these international communist organizations. Now, a couple of books here. One looks extremely elderly, the one on the left, and it is, but you can hunt it down online and find what will almost certainly be some second or third hand copy, giving the documents around the split, which happened in 1948, but there were, aftershocks for a few years. And another, which is still in print, it's by Milovan Djilas, giving an account of his conversations with Stalin, his diplomatic missions to Moscow late in World War II and in the few years after, leading up to the split. And it brilliantly depicts the atmosphere of suspicion around all of that. So, after the split from Stalin, things were really bad for a while. Tito wrote in a letter to Stalin, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them, one of them with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow and I won't have to send a second." He's sounding pretty confident and sure of himself, which is something that Stalin might have liked. Many Yugoslav communists were actually appalled at the break in solidarity, and they sided with Stalin. And a number of these ended up being sent to Goliotok, which was an island for political prisoners.
So we're back with communists imprisoning other communists.
Yeah, just like in the Soviet Union. Yes. And here we've got Goliotok. It means bald island. And here again, the island's shape and barrenness made it very hard to escape from, and also made life there very hard to endure, which was the idea. It had been used as a prison island by the Italians during World War II. And strangely, this island is situated between Krk and Rab, which today vacation hotspots. So people are having an absolutely wonderful time on these 2 islands, and there's a couple of little islands between the 2 of them, and one of them is this place, which was so awful for such a long time. Well, around 32,000 male prisoners endured life on Goliotok, and about 4,000 of them died. Here we've got a picture of the remains of the camp, which was finally closed only in 1988.
Which is not that long ago, all things considered.
No, just a couple of years before the whole enterprise entirely collapses, yeah.
So, moving on to communism at the time, an underdeveloped country. And now, we mentioned last week that the interwar Royal Yugoslavia was still overwhelmingly a peasant society.
Yes, and in the early years of communist Yugoslavia, the same general situation obtained. And as in the USSR itself, communists saw themselves as the bringers of modernization and industrialism, which is all completely opposite to Marxist theory, of course, for any viewers who know anything about that, right? According to Marx, It was capitalism that brought modernization and industrialization and created a proletariat, an industrial working class, who would then overthrow capitalism, and on we go. But the Soviet Union did things the other way around, and communist Yugoslavia was about to do the same. In connection with which, let's look at one of the early projects, the so-called Bratstvo Jedinstvo Autoput, the Brotherhood and Unity Motorway. It was a priority project. The first section between Zagreb and Belgrade was opened in 1950. And as its name and as this 1949 poster make clear, its significance was far more than economic.
Right, because this is partly modernization, but really partly a symbol of reconciliation between Serbs and Croats after the war.
Yes. That's why it's between the Croatian capital of Zagreb and the Serbian capital of Belgrade. And the legend on the poster reads, "Fulfilling our vow, we give this motorway to the people, to the party, and to Tito." Politics is an awful lot of this project. It does make economic sense. A lot of communist projects didn't. This one does make economic sense, but nevertheless, politics was important even there. Okay, here we've got a picture of a youth parade in Petrovets, which was an ethnically Slovak village about 40 miles northwest of Belgrade in 1950. And they are holding a huge picture of Tito there.
Is this what would later be called a cult of personality?
I think it is, really. We always associate that with Stalin, but something similar went on with most of the communist leaders, including Tito. We could say, in the long run at least, Tito was genuinely very popular, even amongst people who were not necessarily convinced communists, because he was able to position himself as the person who'd put an end to all of the terrible killing in World War II. But yeah, it is nevertheless still very noticeable. Well, as in other communist countries, the regime wanted to introduce a program of collectivization of property, especially farmland, and that provoked resistance. Almost all important economic assets were seized from their owners, including foreigners, during 1946 to 48. Until 1949, peasants were allowed to own up to 35 hectares of land themselves, leaving 94% of agricultural land privately owned. What does this tell us? That up until this point, the vast majority of land right across Yugoslavia simply consisted of peasant holdings. It was an overwhelmingly peasant agricultural society. But in 1949, that was confiscated, so that by the following year, nearly 96% was socially owned, i.e. by the state. And predictably, as had happened in other countries, agricultural production fell. And in 1950, there were several small local peasant uprisings, most notably in Sazin in northwest Bosnia, although they were ruthlessly crushed. Unlike in, say, the Soviet Union in the 1930s, it didn't lead to millions and millions of people starving to death. But nevertheless, there was a major fall in agricultural production. Now, if you want to know what Sazin looked like at this time, here it is, a very conservatively Muslim district. And moving some way south, this is a cattle market in Vrlika, Dalmatia. I've got to say, this is one of my favorite photos of all the thousands that I have on my laptop. It's an amazing picture. And I think this is from the same area, maybe even the same place, from the 1950s. A peasant woman with donkeys and a boy with a partisan cap. The partisan cap's about the only modern thing in that picture. Right? As in the last couple of pictures, it could be a scene from centuries ago. And again, with this one, the woman here with the pigs. And here we've got two ladies with sickles. So no mechanization there, or for long after.
So this is the overwhelmingly peasant society that we just mentioned.
Yes. And Yugoslavia was a strange place because you get aspects of modernity, particularly in the big cities, of course, living cheek by jowl with people living like this, or at least something like this, right up to, the 1970s and beyond. I mean, stuff that we consider national dress or traditional peasant dress was worn by ordinary people, not on festive occasions and to display to tourists only, but actually as people's normal wear right down to a generation and a half ago. So, yeah.
Right.
And even in Zagreb, life in 1948 was a long way from modern Western convenience living, as I think we can see here. And yet, this would still have been considered a world away from the scenes that we've just been looking at. Well, in Zagreb, at first, Ban Jelačić was left in his place. That's the statue in the middle there, in the central square in Zagreb. That's from 1945. But the following year, the square was renamed Trg Republike, Republic Square, and Ban Jelačić was at first covered up and then removed and cut into pieces.
Now, why was he removed?
Well, because then, as now, he was an important symbol of Croatian nationalism. He was a major military figure and had been the Ban of Croatia in the mid-19th century. And for various reasons to do with helping the emperor to put down the Hungarian revolt at that time, he became a Croatian national hero. I know that doesn't make sense unless one knows the larger story around it. We don't have time to tell that now. But it was the symbolism that counted and still counts. So yeah, he was taken down. And so in the 1950s, the square looked like this. And by 1966, it was a thoroughfare for traffic. But a long way away from Zagreb, way down south, the primitive style of life of much of the population continued. So Yugoslavia was a land of sharp contrasts. This is near Metković.
Right, and now this is way down south, right on the border between Croatia and Bosnia.
Yes, except that back then it wasn't a border except an administrative one because it's all one country.
Right.
And here we've got a coastal road near Split.
Not much of a road here, is it?
No, it's just gravel.
Right, but today this will be a major highway carrying huge numbers of tourists.
Yeah, but before the tourism money becomes a total flood, people like this lady outside the major towns will be living a very traditional life. Tourism was already there and important, but not utterly transformative of everyday life and dress as it is today. Well, looking further south again, this is Bitola in Macedonia in the mid-1950s, and in Skopje, also in Macedonia.
So we talked about Tito making his break with Stalin.
Right.
And the break with the Soviet Union and its satellites meant that Tito and his colleagues didn't have to run their country on Moscow's orders, so they could try some experiments.
Right, which they did. And starting in 1952, Yugoslavia experiments with workers' self-management. This picture is from a machine tool factory at Slavonski Brod. That was the first one to do this. And these are the 11 members of the Workers' Council.
Okay, so why is this such a big deal?
Well, two things. It's a break from classic communist centralized planning, which was such an obvious failure. And secondly, it made workers feel they were actually part of the socialist project rather than merely the people in whose names things were being done, but whose views and interests were never remotely consulted. So here, well, they are being consulted. So here we've got some guys meeting and discussing the factory's policy at the pub.
It looks like the price of this gain, so to speak, was amateurism. So did this all actually work, like in terms of creating a thriving economy?
Short answer, no, not really. But it did make people feel better. At least it made them feel that they were involved in the economic failure. So here they are during the lunch hour, and members of the bridge construction shop listen to Emil Basic, who explains why the Workers' Council refused them a raise.
That had to have been good.
Yeah, at least they felt they were part of the process.
Yeah.
Well, here we've got a poster promoting Women's Day on March the 8th. And this particular one actually seems to reflect wartime alliances. So I'm guessing it's probably from 1944 or 45. Could be wrong about that. And here we've got some later ones promoting Women's Day.
Now, Women's Day really remains an important public holiday in the countries of ex-Yugoslavia today.
Yes, it is. It's a date in the calendar, a public holiday in Croatia, and I think in most of the others too. So, yes, that's something that has stuck.
That would probably be a good day for me to come visit you then.
Yeah, like the world doesn't revolve around you on all the other days of the year. Right. Just getting a little revenge in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we've got a queue outside the US exhibition in Belgrade because people are wanting to read Western newspapers reporting the death of Stalin in 1953.
Now, it's hard to imagine even this happening in Moscow. So already this is suggesting that there's like a chink of light, actual information getting through.
Oh, yes. As we'll see in a moment, that door would be pushed wide open later on by two things: foreign tourism, Westerners coming in, and permission for Yugoslavs themselves to go and work in West Germany, Yugoslavs going out. And those two things alone meant there was no possibility or even intention of locking the population off from events outside. But in 1953, we're not quite there yet. Well, here we've got a great picture of a shoeshine boy working in Belgrade. We notice that socialism did not eliminate the marginalization of Roma people. And here we've got Dan Mladosti, Youth Day in Maribor, Slovenia. And this is kind of intriguing when we remember how the communist states, most of them, used to castigate Western decadence and keep their people unsullied by Western fashions of all kinds. Not in the case of Yugoslavia, at least not by 1961. So its foreign engagements make it much less resistant to Western novelties. So we've got a jazz festival going on in Bled in Slovenia in 1961. Okay, moving around the country quite a bit here. We've got a double-decker bus in Skopje in the 1950s. And yes, these guys are all involved in operating it. Under communism, all tasks needed surprisingly large numbers of staff.
So, is this down to bureaucracy?
Yes, certainly that. And the need for everyone to have a job. We have no unemployment in the socialist states, right? Even if the jobs are sometimes extremely nominal. But also the universal communist experience, the joke that was told at all times, everywhere: we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. Now we've got to look at a serious tragedy, I'm afraid. On 26th July 1963 at 5:17 in the morning, Skopje was hit by a devastating earthquake. And at least 1,070 people were killed and 200,000 left homeless. 80% of the city was destroyed.
Yeah, and this accounts for why most of Skopje today consists of communist-era buildings.
Yes, it does. It pains me to say this, but it's so obviously true. I have so many wonderful friends in Skopje, but nobody could call the city beautiful. It's overwhelmingly stuff that was put up during that time. Well, here's Tito coming to inspect the damage. And there was a massive international relief effort. And streets there are still named after countries and leaders like J.F. Kennedy, who were conspicuously generous.
Now, naming stuff after Kennedy, I mean, that in itself suggests a very different kind of relationship with the US than would have been the case in the Soviet Union or its satellites.
Yes. Yugoslavia holds this kind of mediating position during the Cold War, which we'll say more about in a moment. But it puts it actually not in a vulnerable position, well, potentially vulnerable, but mostly actually a very strong position. Staying with the Skopje disaster for a moment, this shows a makeshift living after the earthquake. Of course, people simply in tents or whatever could be done. And in practice, what that meant, rather like in British cities during World War II, kids were moved away while serious stuff was being constructed and then brought back. Well, looking north here, this is Belgrade in 1968. Tolerably modern living conditions coming to much of Yugoslavia for millions of ordinary people who had been living in pre-modern housing in rural poverty in places down south like Tsaribrod or somewhere like that. This will have seemed like paradise. Communism bringing real modernization and flush toilets and indoor plumbing, even if all rather rickety. So, yeah, it would have seemed great.
Right. And you could probably go on about this for a while, since I know modernist and especially communist architecture is one of your favorite things to hate on.
Yes, it is. Nobody could possibly admire the architecture in that building, but even I would be prepared to concede that the living conditions inside it would be better than some of the places that people had come from. Okay, well, here we've got a Jugopetrol gas station in the 1960s.
Yes, and they've got mini skirts as a uniform. I mean, this really is the cool communist country, isn't it?
Right, yeah, you can't really imagine this happening in the Soviet Union. At all, not at all. Although the uniform nature of it, of course, makes me smile. That's the slightly communistic edge to it, I suppose. But yes. But some regions still remain stuck in another age. So here's a bazaar in Pej, to give it its Serbian name, or Peja, its Albanian name, in Kosovo in 1967. And again, in Kosovo in the late 60s.
So the legacy of the Ottoman Empire lingered in the poorer southern regions.
Yes, and if we do the math here, the Ottomans were only 50 years gone.
Right.
Going to be very, very slow to change. In this last picture here from Kosovo, the two young guys on the left, either they're foreign tourists or maybe people from the big city going down to Kosovo. They look modern, or at least relatively modern.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've referred several times to Yugoslavia's unique international position. And so it's time to look at how that was utilized. So Tito was one of the main creators of something called the non-aligned movement. That is, of countries that didn't want to align with the US-led West or the Soviet-led communist bloc during the Cold War. So it's initiated in 1961 by Nehru, on the left there, and Nkrumah, the Ghanaian dictator, Nasser from Egypt, Sukarno, Indonesia, and then Tito. So it aimed to give mutual support and reassurance to states not wishing to take sides in the Cold War. And it tried to give them collective influence over the superpowers.
Because during the Cold War, most countries, especially in the global south, felt strong pressure to come into the US or the Soviet side. So this is offering them a way out by helping them to band together.
Yes, it would have been easier to stand together than for individual countries to do so. And Yugoslavia took a lead role.
Yeah, so where earlier in the century this region had been a constant source of international conflict, now all of a sudden during the Cold War it was carving out a positive role for itself.
Yes, and Tito was excellent at milking that, which gave him a high profile abroad and also bolstered his popularity at home. Now, in practice in this organization, a lot of member states tended to greater alignment with one or other of the superpowers. It was designed to give them the latitude not to have to do that. Now, it really lost its raison d'etre after the end of the Cold War, but it still exists You rarely hear about it these days. It doesn't play a significant role. But like a lot of organizations, they continue to exist even after they've lost their original reason for having come into existence. Okay, well, here we've got Tito with Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie on the 19th of August 1959. Now, I find this hilarious and ironic. We've got a communist and an emperor. But part of the irony is that despite that apparent huge gulf between them, both men are authoritarian rulers of their countries in practice. So maybe the chasm isn't as huge as one might have thought.
I would imagine that Tito, in his heart of hearts, probably felt a little bit like an emperor.
Yes, and lived like one with all his hunting lodges and what have you around the place and his fancy yachts. Yeah, he certainly lived like an emperor. Yeah, he's been described by, I forget which historian it was, as the last Habsburg. And I think the designation was given as the last person who could hold all these different people groups together. But it would also apply in terms of the opulence in which he lived as well. Yeah. Okay, so here he is meeting with Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Indira Gandhi of India in 1967. Here he is with Soviet leader Khrushchev. He and Khrushchev dancing with locals in Cetinje, which was the old capital of Montenegro, because Yugoslavia at the time was about to receive hundreds of millions of dollars in loans from Western countries on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other.
So, had there been a reconciliation with the Soviet Union?
Well, kind of, sort of, yes. They're certainly no longer thinking about sending assassins to kill off one another's leaders. But that still left Yugoslavia outside of the Warsaw Pact and Comecon and these other kind of communist Soviet-dominated international organizations. Well, Tito's mediating position during the Cold War made him courted by all sides. So here he is in the White House at a dinner held in his honor in 1971 with Richard and Pat Nixon. And here he is the following year with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, who came to visit Yugoslavia. Poor old Queen, she had to shake hands with a whole lot of different people during her long reign. Tito was far from the worst. But she had to even suck up to Romania's Ceausescu at some point, which must have been very galling for her.
She really is one of my most favorite historical figures. Apart from you, of course.
Apart from it, thank you very much. That's a low blow, Mrs. Campo. Right.
It's just too much fun, though.
Yeah. Me, historical, you wish, right? I'm going to cling to life for a little longer, I think.
Out of spite.
Out of spite. To turn to the topic of Gastarbeiter, means guest workers. West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle after 1950, created a huge demand for labour. Far from any unemployment, a huge lack of workers. And so millions of foreigners came to work there. And Yugoslavia was one of the larger contributors. I spent a year myself as a Gastarbeiter in Germany in the 1970s. In the place where I worked, most of the others were Turks. But there was one lone Yugoslav, I remember. But anyway, Yugoslavia sent a lot. People had slipped illegally into Western Europe during the 1950s, when it was still closed off to the West. But in the mid-60s, Yugoslavia lifted emigration restrictions. By 1973, there were 1.1 million workers, Yugoslav workers and dependents living abroad, especially in West Germany. So by 1985, the number was still 1 million, 60% of them workers, 40% dependents. In the early 1970s, Yugoslav Gastarbeiter were mostly mature urban males from the northwest, so Slovenia and Croatia, with specific skills. By the 1980s, that had changed, and 70% of them were rural people doing unskilled tasks. Now, what did Yugoslavia get out of this? It eased the country's unemployment problems because you could simply ship them abroad. And it brought in hard currency, Deutschmarks. But the loss of skilled workers actually slowed growth in some Yugoslav industries.
Right, so no one was under any illusions about the huge gap between Yugoslav living standards and those in West Germany.
No, no. I think most people in most communist countries really did know that there was a huge gap. Perhaps not in the Soviet Union itself. So Tito just kind of said, "Well, we'll take this on the chin. There's no hiding it. It's there anyway. People are generally aware of it. Let's simply take advantage of what we can." And so this is why the ability to speak German, for example, persisted amongst large elements of the population because so many had lived there either as workers or as dependents. And many people came home with nice Western cars, particularly BMWs, and why so many houses, particularly in the northern parts of Yugoslavia, look like they're German style because people had come home with a pile of money and decided to build themselves a proper house. Well, what was that going to look like? Like the ones they saw in Germany. So, yeah,
Right.
that has persisted. Okay, well, what about Yugoslavia's internal problems, which were clearly pretty severe? And we can see this from the fact that they kept issuing so many constitutions, which is almost humorous, really. I mean, one thing that historians can see across many periods and many different countries is that if a law has to keep on being reissued every few years, it's not being obeyed, right? If a country has to keep issuing new constitutions, it's because the previous one wasn't getting it quite right. So there are four during the lifetime of a state, which, when you think about it, only lasts for 46 years. Well, the first one formally recognized Macedonian as a language, but from a kind of coldly pragmatic point of view, Tito needed to reduce the size of the population that claimed to be Serb or that was claimed to be Serb. And this was one good way of doing it. The first constitution established 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and 2 autonomous provinces within Serbia, Vojvodina and Kosovo. The census in 1971 allowed people to claim Muslim as their nationality within Bosnia, which is a fact that remains with us. So no more stupid Ustasha type claims that Bosnian Muslims were really Croats of the Islamic faith, or on the other hand by Serbs that they were really Serbs. And the 1974 constitution, which is the world's longest, gave veto powers within Serbia to the autonomous provinces, with pretty serious consequences for the future. Well, what about language, which is a vexed topic? There was a government-backed agreement, the Novi Sad Agreement in 1954, by important writers and linguists to establish the norms of a common tongue. And its conclusions included: Serbs, Croats, and Montenegrins share a single language with 2 equal variants. Officially, the name of the language must make reference to its 2 constituent parts, i.e. both Serbian and Croatian. And that meant it was referred to either as Serbo-Croat or Croato-Serbian. And in practice, virtually everybody outside the country used the first of those. I grew up with this always being referred to as Serbo-Croat. The Roman and Cyrillic alphabets have equal status, and Serbs and Croats are expected to learn both alphabets in school, which they did. Right, so to this day in Croatia, for example, where I live, adults who went to school during the communist period can read Cyrillic alphabet as easily as you like. Anybody younger than a certain age which would now be, I guess, 50, can't read it and has actively been discouraged from doing so. Well, the Matica Srpska, that's a long-standing body governing the norms of the Serbian language, will cooperate with the Matica Hrvatska, the Croatian equivalent, in the production of a new dictionary of the joint language. Work will proceed on the establishment of a common terminology for all spheres of economic, scholarly, and cultural life. Both sides will cooperate in the compiling of a joint orthographic manual. Now, these books still appear in schools. They're very different today to what they were then. They're called pravopis, literally means correct writing, so orthography. Care must be given to the natural development of Croato-Serbian, and no longer should texts be altered from one variant to another. Well, I think that's a bit of an overstatement. There wasn't much attention to natural development. This was trying to govern things from the top and to drive forms of speech together to be as similar as possible.
So this whole exercise was all about stressing the unity of speech as much as possible. And like you said, all the school kids were taught to read both alphabets with complete ease.
Yes, and they could. In Serbia, they still can, because the Latin alphabet is used for all kinds of purposes still in Serbia today. Okay, so here is the resultant 1960 pravopis. Pravopisi today in Serbia and Croatia are obsessed with doing exactly the opposite to this one. That is, in stressing the differences and maximizing them and creating new norms at maximum distance from one another. Bearing out, yes, my favorite adage that you quoted at me a few minutes ago. But a number of Croatian politicians and scholars and linguists in 1967 produced a declaration on the status and name of the Croatian literary language. It was a protest against what they saw as the sidelining of literary Croatian. They believed that in practice, Serbian was being imposed as the state language, and they called for the equal use of 4 languages, Slovene, Croatian, Serbian, and Macedonian, in Yugoslavia. No mention of Albanian or Hungarian, with Croatian used in schools and media in Croatia. They said, in the state administrative system, in the means of public and mass communication, as well as in the language of the federal army, federal governing bodies, legislature, diplomacy, and political organizations, the Croatian language is being pushed out and brought into unequal position into the level of province speech through the imposing of a state language. So this marks the beginning of what will later be called the Croatian Spring, Hrvatsko proljeće, or Maspok, short for Masovni pokret, mass movement. And here we've got actual demonstrations 4 years later in 1971. And this becomes a pretty widespread phenomenon. So from 1968, the movement grew into demands for wider Croatian autonomy within Yugoslavia, demands to keep more of the profits from tourism, which, so it was argued, generated 50% of all foreign currency entering Yugoslavia, of which just 7% remained within Croatia. So their argument was Croatia should keep more of the money that its resources have earned. There were demands for curbs, not on immigration, but on emigration, because of the labour shortages created in Croatian businesses. Demands to end the JNA's practice of forcing conscripts to serve outside of their own republics. The JNA was the Yugoslav National Army. Conscripts were forced to serve outside of their own republics for 2 reasons. One was the reason that many countries had done in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that was to take a provincial boy and make him feel like a citizen of the whole country by getting him to serve somewhere else. But the other reason, which is a rather darker one, is that if there ever were any unrest, soldiers from one republic might be more willing to fire upon crowds and citizens of those from another. So there was a demand to end that. The movement was harshly repressed, and the increasingly liberal party leadership in some republics, especially in Croatia, was dismissed. But just a couple of years later, the Constitution of 1974, the crazily long one, quietly met some of the Croatian Spring's demands.
It seems like the kind of thing where you could really understand both sides, right? Like, of course, Croatians are going to want to keep their own people and their money within Croatia, but then from a broader perspective, you can also see how this would really encourage the nationalism that Tito and communism was trying to sort of smooth over.
Right. I mean, this was the problem with the whole project and why it fell apart. It took surprisingly a long time after Tito's death. But this situation constantly reminds me of the situation of Oliver Cromwell in Republican England. You know, he was the only person who could keep the show on the road. And once he died, the whole thing fell apart and the monarchy came back. Well, here you've got Tito trying to do the same thing, in a sense, keep the show on the road, even though it's a difficult one. And there's so many moving parts that don't really fit into that. And when he died, you know, nobody else could juggle spoons quite as fast as he could. And so the thing slowly declines. But it also reminds me of Roger Scruton's famous expression, the pre-political we. Now, he was talking about the context of democracies, that for democracies to be stable, everybody must feel that they belong to it. Before any politics even gets discussed at all, of what party you like, what policies you want to pursue, there must be a we who feel that they belong together. And sadly, within Yugoslavia, no matter how frantically Tito and the state organizations worked, loads of people didn't really feel that. There were plenty who did, but there were even more who didn't. So, yeah, that was the problem.
So I have a feeling this is going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, it's going to get a lot worse. Yes, yes. So the leadership needs to put a stop to all of this. As Gorbachev found 15 years later in the Soviet Union, allowing people a little freedom means they'll use it to demand more freedom. And in the end, you then have to choose between renewing repression or allowing complete disintegration. The choice becomes that kind of stark. And of course, Tito's trying to juggle between those. Well, just staying with this topic for a moment, here we've got a picture of Savka Dabčević Kučar, who was Prime Minister of the Socialist Republic of Croatia. Remember, it's a federal system. So there are state governments under the federal government in Belgrade. So she's the Croatian Prime Minister. And she actually supported the protesters. And clearly she's not going to keep her position once this is suppressed. Here's another one of these pictures of demonstrations, and the banner reads, Bolje grob nego rob, better the grave, or better dead than a slave. Better the grave than a slave. That rhymes in English too. Book recommendation here. This is a new book just come out this year by Batovic. Covers the subject very well. And in the process, it also gives the reader a good view of communist Yugoslavia during the 2 decades before the Croatian Spring. Okay, and he sums the situation up this way, talking about its long-term consequences. Because of its multinational structure and long-standing divisions that had haunted the country since its establishment in 1918, Yugoslavia would probably not have survived the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the communist bloc, regardless of how the political crisis of 1971 was resolved. Basically, he thinks Yugoslavia was doomed in any case. But he just makes this hypothetical suggestion here that maybe there might have been a chance if it had been dealt with differently, with the purge of the progressive and liberal political elite in all the Yugoslav republics. Tito might have eliminated the very force that could have given Yugoslavia a chance to negotiate a peaceful dissolution, which might have prevented the bloody drama that unfolded 20 years later. So what Bartovic is saying is that Yugoslavia had zero chance of surviving, but there might have been a chance that it would have dissolved peacefully.
Only if Tito had left these dissenters alone, basically.
Yes, yes. Maybe he might have taken some measures to cut down on the protests a bit, but basically leave those elites in place. But he didn't do that.
Yeah, it seems like all communist regimes were perpetually shuttling back and forth between bouts of repression and relaxation, and then repression and then relaxation again.
Yeah, that's particularly marked in the case of the Soviet Union, but it's there too in Yugoslavia. Yes. Well, now coming to the end here, we need to think about life without Tito. So here he is in 1971. His personal popularity remained genuinely high. This is him in Rijeka. And here we have 200,000 people turning out to greet him in 1979 in Split. By the following year, he was dead. And a poster, well, actually, it's from Novi List, the newspaper, issued right after that. Comrade Tito, we swear to you not to deviate from your path. So that's the week after his death in May 1980. And Yugoslavia had just a decade left. Now, what actually did replace it was a rotating presidency. So the federal presidency passed to people from the different republics. But nobody had anything like Tito's status or magnetism. Djilas was no longer part of the party and hadn't been for a long time. Rankovic and Kardelj were dead. There was nobody of that kind of status to replace him, really. So the system became highly bureaucratic and very obviously just trying to keep things going. Djilas predicted in 1981 that Yugoslavia would collapse. He says, our system was built only for Tito to manage. Now that Tito's gone, now our economic situation becomes critical, there'll be a natural tendency for greater centralization of power. But this centralization will not succeed because it will run up against the ethnic political power bases in the republics. This isn't classical nationalism, but a more dangerous bureaucratic nationalism built on economic self-interest. This is how the Yugoslav system will begin to collapse. And later that decade, commenting on what Gorbachev was doing in the Soviet Union, speaking to a Western magazine, they've come to realize what other communists in Yugoslavia, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and China realized much earlier, namely that communism doesn't work. It works neither at the economic level nor at the level of satisfying essential human needs and liberties.
So this took a little while to unravel.
Yes, but what made the unraveling certain was after 1985, the slow collapse of communism generally. If communism was going to give way to democracy, it was obvious to most people that the various peoples of Yugoslavia wouldn't necessarily want to stay together. So if communism is going to give way to democracy, Yugoslavia is going to fall apart because only force had held it together. Finally, we've got a picture here of the 1984 Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, which was a huge success. The world marveled, and I say the world marveled because people come from all over the place, but also it's on television internationally, right? At the city itself and at the model of cultural richness and harmony. So you've got Catholic Croats, Serbian Orthodox, Muslims all living together and apparently functioning pretty well. And this was one of the things that caused such extreme shock when the Bosnian War broke out in 1992. How could this possibly happen? We thought this place was an idyll of multiculturalism. And of course, that wasn't how it worked out at all. So what happens in the early 1990s is that this whole structure comes completely and violently unglued.
Right, and that coming ungluing is the very thing that we're going to be considering in next week's episode.
Yes, which is the last episode in this series before we move on to something completely different. So yes, please do stay with us for that, everybody. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
And if you enjoyed this episode, we make our usual plea to repost this on social media anywhere and everywhere and inflict our commentary on the rest of the world. We would greatly appreciate that. And we hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, really, everybody. Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever it is that you're connected to, please repost us on that. But we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.